everyone, welcome to another episode of Consciousness Rising Zimbabwe and Beyond, where we hold the conscious conversation. And by now we have probably more than 40 conversations, so please go and check our YouTube channel and we'll put all our links below. And today we are going to talk of a very important topic. Actually, I feel like we are stepping I feel we need to step back a bit in our conscious conversation, because the topic of today, which is breaking the cycle of violence with Susan Wyatt. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much.
And I was saying stepping back a bit, because generally we bring you conversation which has really going towards the light and all that, but sometimes we need to clear what's under the rug, all the dirt under the rug. And unfortunately, violence is a big topic. There is a lot of mental health issue coming out from there. And so yesterday I met Susan. It was a very serendipitous meeting. And when I have heard that, I didn't meet her for a very long time. And when I heard what she was saying, I said, please come on board on our conversation, because I think that what you do is something that people need to hear at the moment. And so let me just give you a bit of the background of Susan. And she's an occupational therapist and an expert in transcultural mental health and community-based trauma healing. She has an international career spanning from Australia, the Great Lakes regions in Africa, and Zimbabwe. And she's contributed to the nexus between clinical mental health and peace building, with some publication that she's done for the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum and the Trauma Research Foundation. She's almost ready to finish her master's in Anthropology and Development this year, and she's focusing on conflict and development. And now she's working from Zimbabwe. And she trains independently psychotherapists and development consultants to provide strategies to navigate, give them, doing capacity building. Welcome again, Susan. We are happy to have you here. And so let's start. So you moved to Australia in 2006. You became an occupational therapist, and after 2009, what happened?
Once I graduated, I worked in clinical mental health, and then I slowly moved over into the community space, where I worked in the torture and trauma services in Australia for the next about 7 or 8 years, before starting my own work. And in the torture and trauma space, we were working mainly with refugees and asylum seekers who had experienced conflict in their home countries and had been granted refugee status or safety in Australia. But they were now dealing with the impact of what they'd experienced through conflict or torture or violence, and then having to move away from their home country. So I worked there for a while, and then I started my...
Where
they were coming from the Middle East, we had Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. From Africa, we had Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Sudan. We also had people from Nepal and Vietnamese. So anyway, that there had been conflict, and it changed according to where the conflicts were. But yeah, worked with people from all over the world. Learned a lot about culture. Met really beautiful, amazing people from everywhere.
So what were the things that you noticed the most?
I think for myself, I had been through conflict and trauma in Zimbabwe related to politics and, national level conflict and violence. So when I went to Australia, I felt like that was when my healing journey really started, and I started to unpack what was going on. What was this all about? Why did this happen? And it was easier to.
What happened? You can share it.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm, and in Zimbabwe, there's a big history around land in Zimbabwe. And in the 2000s, there was a land reform program here that most people are familiar with. And I experienced that myself. It started when I was about 14, and through my teenage years, I witnessed and experienced some direct violence against my family, and against people that I connected with and identified with. Death threats. We got locked and barricaded in our house. We witnessed people, not directly, but we knew of people that were murdered and targeted. So it was quite a violent time. And at that age, not understanding why was this happening and why was I being targeted? I hadn't done anything wrong. That was how I felt at the time. So it was a big learning curve to have to leave Zimbabwe and try and understand that, know that there were reasons why it happened, but how the land reform program came about and how it unfolded was really wrong, and it's perpetuated a cycle of violence in our country. So I had my own personal experience of that, and then when I moved to Australia, I was able to work through my own trauma, but also work with other people that had experienced conflict at that kind of level, and start to understand what the healing process is and how do we support people in collective healing. Because although trauma happens at an individual level, the impact is felt collectively. It's felt through relationships, it's felt through communities. So for me, it went on a tangent of we need collective healing. We can't just focus on an individual. And yes, I met, people often say to me, well, the work you do must be really awful, torture and trauma. But actually, it's in those people and in that place that I meet some of the most incredible people, the most resilient. People survive purely on the kindness of others and people caring for each other. So you actually see a very strong, beautiful side to humanity. So yes, we look after ourselves in that space, but it's also quite an empowering, insightful space.
Collective healing, that's also a big word, because it's like raising above, looking from a bird eye view perspective and giving support to the community to do. So how do we really break this cycle of violence and trauma that comes out of it?
I just want to share this one slide. It's from the Center for Justice and Peace Building because it explains it quite nicely. And yeah, for the visual learners like me, it's much easier. So what we want to understand, in order to understand, obviously, healing, we need to know how does trauma manifest? Mm-hmm. And like I said, it can happen on the individual level. So if we go to this red circle, the traumatic event or the act of violence, and what it does to us individually, obviously we have that immediate impact in our body and our mind, and it can cause all these responses in us. But as that goes on, if we're not taken to a safe place, or we're not given justice, or we're not given any kind of healing, it manifests in guilt and rage and unprocessed grief, ambiguous loss. And at an individual level, you start seeing people trying to cope with this in ways that can be unhelpful, like self-harm or substance abuse, even suicidal ideation. So at an individual level, that's happening. And that starts to impact people's family relationships, partner and intimate relationships, their relationships with their children. So we call this the acting in cycle. It's damaging for the person themselves. But if this is carried on and it's manifested in the collective, right, because maybe it's done to a whole community, or a whole group of people, whether that's religious or ethnic or geographical, you then get this amplified. So all the households are experiencing this, all the communities experiencing this. And this goes on, we see the acting out cycle, where you start to develop these, what we call identity markers. So people feel that they're different from someone else. They identify with the survivor or the victim group. They're identified as other. You get discrimination, and you start developing these stories that they're meant to help you feel better and feel protected, but they can further cycles of, you know, revenge seeking, violence in the community. It normalizes violence, because if you're in a power dynamic and you can't get justice and you can't get your trauma acknowledged, your last resort is to use violence to try and get some form of healing. So often you'll see things like increases in domestic violence, child abuse, in these kind of communities related to this historical event or a community level event. And people will seek justice and they will feel right about it, and they will they develop these collective narratives to be able to do what they want to do. So you see then the victim starts to become a perpetrator as well.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand how this happens, because when we then want to break the cycle, there are various ways we can do that. But it's easy to get lost in the hopelessness of this, or see domestic violence and see it as something very separate to, you know, political trauma or national level trauma. And in Zimbabwe, we have a very real sense of hopelessness at times about our situation. How would we improve? So I'm very happy to be here to talk about how can we bring people to a place where we start discussing how are we going to move forward collectively and as a country from a healing perspective.
Yeah, I know that at the moment there is so many webinar, seminar on mental health, really, because there's so much. People start to become dysfunctional, like you were saying, start to become dysfunctional in families, and people don't understand where it comes from. So there's so many people who are asking questions at the moment, and it's so important. So what advice, through your experience, through what you have seen over the years, what are the ways that people can go about it? Because, for example, you were telling me yesterday that you were in the States explaining the situation in Zimbabwe, and they were seeing themselves just by listening what's happening in another country. They could see themselves where they are at the moment. So just tell us a bit more about that.
So yeah, trying to break the cycle of violence, we need to understand the dynamics of it. So for example, racism is where you target someone or discriminate someone because of the color of their skin. It doesn't matter which direction it's going or to which color, person it is. The dynamic is the same. You're discriminating against them because of their skin color. And in Zimbabwe, we experience that in all different directions. So we need to understand this dynamic and this history, and it's a very sensitive topic, So first and foremost, we need to sensitize people to this topic, because you can imagine people get triggered by this really easily, and they get defensive and they get protective and they get angry. So we have to create safe spaces for people to talk, and we need to sensitize people to this, that it's something that we need to do. We need to create safe spaces, emotionally safe places. Culturally, people aren't used to talking about this stuff. So we need to provide mechanisms and pathways with trained people that know how to take someone through this journey. So at an individual level, there's, obviously different types of therapies, but we also, in Zimbabwe, there's a few different NGOs that provide group-based work. There's Heal Zimbabwe, there's the Zimbabwe Peace Project, there's Tree of Life Trust, who I do lots of consulting for, and they've developed these group processes where they go into communities and bring people back together and take you through a process where you get to do your own testimony, your own what's happened to you, you're able to share that, you're taken through a healing process. And that's really important. We were trained last year, 5 of us were trained in a program done in Rwanda, and unfortunately COVID has delayed us, but we hope to get that going here in Zimbabwe. So there's the healing mechanism, because on one side, people also need justice and accountability, right, for things that have been done to them. And so some people are more maybe political and justice focused, and depending on the survivor, we can support them to do that if they need to do that. Truth-telling processes where people can tell what happened, things like exhumations, which is where they're locating bodies of people that were killed, for example, in the genocide, and they are digging them up and finding out what happened to those people, and then providing them a proper burial so that there's closure for the families. So there's stuff you can do at an individual level. And then more publicly and collectively, we need acknowledgement. We need acknowledgement of our historical traumas from way back, tribal and colonial times. What are these historical traumas? And again, very sensitive topics. People don't want to hear that maybe their ancestors were part of being perpetrators at one stage. So we really need to create a nurturing, safe place for people to be able to come to that. So public acknowledgement, memorials, murals, things that really acknowledge our history, where we've been and where we would like to go. And then I suppose we need to rebuild our social fabric in Zimbabwe. It's been very fractured. We have people in different corners defending their own narratives, not willing to cross over the divide and hear other people's stories. It's hard to tolerate. I've been through many processes. Even when I went to Rwanda last year, and I thought, I've done this for so long now, I'm so experienced. I was crying my eyes out, giving my own testimony of trauma and healing. So it's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, and it doesn't take just one thing to end the pain. So bringing people back together so we rebuild connections and relationships is going to be really important.
So in all this cycle of violence, in all the things that happens and the reflection of it, and in the fragmentation of the society, the tapestry of the society. So what other things have you come across with your work?
So some of the manifestations of these cycles of violence that we've seen in Zimbabwe, we've seen it impact us at a national level, and that's impacted our economy massively. So we're seeing lots of problems related to livelihoods, food insecurity. We're needing more humanitarian kind of support because we've kind of broken our own economy with these unhealed cycles of violence. Something else that I've been working on in the last year is, for example, we had women that were trafficked out of Zimbabwe to the Middle East, quite a huge amount of women. Some of the reports are saying up to 800 women were trafficked. And we only managed to get about 170 to 200 of them back. So we've been working with a group of women on a healing process for that. But basically, in a situation like Zimbabwe is in, where our economy is struggling and people are struggling at an individual level, it was very easy then to set up a very sophisticated trafficking network here, offer people further education, offer them working pathways, selling the idea that they would be able to make money and support their family back in Zimbabwe. These women didn't know about international travel. They weren't aware of stuff. They hadn't been exposed to that before. They were recruited through their church networks. They were recruited through family networks. People were paid to recruit them. They were not, tied up and stuffed into bags and trafficked that way. They were made to believe that this was a legitimate situation. So they went willingly. And this organization offered to take them through transport, and then was able to take their passports off them, with no fighting, because it was done in a very sophisticated way. And then when these women got to the Middle East, they were sold off through some to Syria, some into Libya, some to Iraq, and then a lot through in Kuwait and Dubai area. And after some months, some of them were able to run away. When they really realized what was going on, they experienced different kinds of abuse and exploitation. They didn't all experience the same thing, but they managed to then get to the South African and Zimbabwe embassy, and the International Organization of Migration was able to bring them back to Zimbabwe. But when they got back, it was, they had nothing on them, nothing to their name. So, and they were highly stigmatized. Again, it broke their relationships in their families and communities because of what they were seen to have gone through. So we're trying to work with these women to restore their self-esteem, their identity. They're incredibly strong. They've really gone through a lot and have shown us resilience. So yeah, in situations like this, people will be vulnerable to different forms of exploitation. They will be vulnerable to propaganda. They will easily absorb information because they don't know anything otherwise. Our education system has been dismantled a lot as well. So we have more vulnerable people that will be susceptible to different things.
Yes. And it's, this thing of the women trafficking is happening, it's quite common. I remember there were in Italy as well, coming from Romania and the East Europe, East Europe, and then it's the same story. Then they get your passport and that's it. And all that starts very simply, and it's quite incredible. It's really quite incredible. We need to come really together in the same space and sharing stories, because there's a power in being heard. The power of healing is also in being heard. And it's not sharing story to stay in the victim mode. Absolutely not. It's just a way to acknowledge what happened, because that's the first step to come out of it. Before, you were saying that each one in Zimbabwe, many different cultures are all in their little corners and their little cliques, and they still don't mix and they don't know each other. So coming together in these spaces could really bring a total different perspective to each other cultures and who we are as human beings, instead of necessarily being called cultural group, races, and so on. So what's happening in Zimbabwe on a bigger level? Is any political support? There is, what's happening?
There is some political support. So we have the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission in Zimbabwe, which has been running for a few years. They are offering a truth-telling process. They are trying to support finding out what happened to people. They're focusing a lot on some of the political violence, so particularly around the genocide in the 80s. But we have to be very careful with opening old wounds and not providing a healing mechanism, because we don't want to re-traumatize people. So in that way, there is some process around that. If you're in a situation where there's not political will, or there isn't a top-down support for such a mechanism, you can still do it at the community level. So providing a healing mechanism even at community level, without public acknowledgement from the government, is still providing an avenue for healing. Some people will be stronger in their need for justice, and some people it will be enough to go through their own individual process and be able to process that and let go. So everyone needs different things. It needs to be, and people need to feel in control of it. They can't be forced to go and give a personal testimony. They can't be forced to talk about their own trauma histories. So we need to create culturally appropriate ways as well that people feel they can participate, contribute their story, be heard, like you said, being able to narrate your story and have people witness it and acknowledge your pain and validate your pain can be very healing. It just needs to be done safely so you don't get re-triggered and re-traumatized, feel, a sense of hopelessness again.
The word community comes over and over and over and over these days. It's like people need to believe in the community. The power of the community is just so big. It's like the foundation.
And I mean, we are social beings, and we are interdependent. You don't want to be codependent in an unhealthy way with anybody, but we are social and interdependent beings. So, and that's very much what COVID has shown us, hasn't it? In the last year, where we've been in lockdowns and we've been separated, we suddenly realize how important our relationships are. And that ultimately, trauma and violence, particularly what we call organized violence and torture, it's done to an individual, but it's done deliberately to break their social fabrics and break their social support systems, because our social networks are so important. So when we talk about community, that, like I said, could be related to your ethnicity, your identity, your religion. It could be where you're located geographically. Whatever that community is, it's really important. And your social supports are essential for your well-being. If we're isolated and disconnected from people, it affects our well-being a lot. And there's a fantastic book called Tribe by a war journalist called Sebastian Junger. And he talks about how, developed countries, first world countries, actually have some of the worst mental health outcomes because people are so isolated and communities so fractured there. And actually some of our communities in Africa that are still very community oriented, connected to each other, even our collective identity of Ubuntu for some cultures, you're only okay if the rest of your network is okay. So just seeing the importance of individualism versus collective and we're really acknowledging that that's important now.
Another issue which I'm very aware of is that people can be really proactive when something happens, but then when they have to deal with their own trauma, or there is kind of we put a wall, and it's something that we don't want to deal with, to get out of it, not to dwell, but so what are the suggestions there?
Yeah, I think we're really good in Zimbabwe. We've learned how to rely on ourselves because maybe we don't have government systems or social support systems that can back us up. So we've developed, in emergencies, we're really good at rallying together, helping each other. But when it comes to your own personal mental health or your own trauma or your own history, it's a sensitive topic. We don't talk about it easily. We're not very good in Zimbabwe at talking mental health, right? But also when you talk about it at a national level, people see it as political. So they get quite scared to say anything, to get involved in it. So we need to create these spaces. We need to open the conversation around it. We need to, in fact, in Zimbabwe, we don't even really have pathways for example, the white community to be able to access healing mechanisms on collective trauma. You might go to a therapist, but you wouldn't sit in workshops where you talk about national level trauma. It's not very common. So we need to try and create those spaces, and again, sensitize people. It might take a couple of years, talking to different networks, business networks, church networks, community networks, schools even. We really need to do more in schools around peace leadership, peace education. At the moment, we learn about other people's histories because it's too sore and it's too political to learn about our own. But if we oriented it in a way that was, restorative or healing-centered education, and help people from a younger age be able to talk about this stuff, we'll be doing it for the next generation. But definitely, we need to bring the topic up. We need to allow people to talk about it, and sensitize them so that when they come into a workshop, they're in a safe enough place and they're ready to disclose or to listen or to just tolerate what is actually happening in our country across the different divides. So that we can move people forward collectively.
Is anything that you would like to add before we wrap it up?
Nothing in particular. I just, there are different people really trying very hard at the local level to move this forward. Small initiatives that people can participate in, things like the Kites for Peace project, Zimbabwe. They are small initiatives, but they bring people together. And again, just small things like getting to know your neighbor, participating in local events with other people, start to rebuild our relationships with each other. Even if you're not ready to do something bigger, just keep listening to the conversation, stay aware of it. Don't pretend like it's not happening and like nothing happened. It's just, people always say, healing starts with yourself. So you can't expect healing to be at a national level when you haven't taken the first step as an individual on the journey. So I would really encourage people to think about their own healing. What do they need? Because that will contribute to the healing in Zimbabwe.
Yes. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, Antonella.
I'm just like, this is like my mind is coming out with many different questions, but for time purposes, no. I would invite people to ask questions actually in the comment below in the YouTube. If there are few questions that you really would like to be answered, if Susan, if you are available to do that, that would be fantastic. Because I know that there are lots of people at the moment searching and knowing that what we see is not what it is. I mean, it could be different. It could be absolutely different. So I wish you well in your work, and
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Stay in touch. I'm happy to answer questions and whatever we need to get this conversation going for people. So thank you for having me.